Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Rhombus Tix, and this is the series I'm calling Swamp Castle. I'm going to be reading The Great Zamboni Napping for you. Barbara and Sandy drove the car as fast as they could. There were no towns between them and their destination, but they both knew that it was only a matter of time before someone woke up and discovered that they'd stolen the Zamboni. Barbara looked at her sister and scratched her head, gesturing to the trailer behind them. "Now explain to me how this is supposed to work again?" Sandy gently stroked her sister's pigtail. "Look, the plan is simple. We take the Zamboni and use it to smooth out all the ice in front of the bank, so that when the robbers come out with the money, all they have to do is hit the ground and spill all over the place, and then we catch them and wait for the police to arrive." "I don't see how this saves the farm." Barbara batted Sandy's hand away, but Sandy continued to fiddle with it. It helped her think. Barbara didn't understand why Sandy couldn't grow out her own goddamn ponytail and use those to think instead. She had shaved her head bald twice, but Sandy eventually convinced anyone in the town to keep from cutting her hair in any way but ponytails. There were disadvantages to living in a small town. They drove down the side roads, and they drove slow. They didn't want to wake anyone up. Sandy smiled. "Simple. When they're arresting the robbers, we hide one of the bags. They will be so much money that no one will miss it." Barbara really doubted that. Sandy was smart. She really was. Her plans had a way of working when there was no logical reason to. But even Sandy went too far sometimes. Barbara was pretty sure this was one of them, but convincing Sandy of that was a little pointless. Slowly, the Zamboni chugged through the night, puffs of steam plummeting through the air. "It's running out of fuel." "Well, what fuels this thing?" Barbara asked. "Hell if I know. Probably gas." They pulled the Zamboni over on the side of the road and poured gas into the fuel tank. It seemed to work well. Barbara thought about it. I think I remember a tour of the Milwaukee hockey rink where they said it was plugged in." "Well, then I guess we got lucky then," Barbara sighed. "Sandy?" "Yes, Barbara?" "You've thought this plan through, right?" "Yes." "Then why didn't you know how to fuel the Zamboni?" "Shut up, Barbara." So much for the attempt to appeal to reason. There was a part of Barbara's mind that told her that she should leap off now and walk back to town. She knew that she was never going to convince her sister that this was a horrible idea, and it would only end in tears. But she couldn't. Since their father had died, their mother had fallen ill. Now they were losing the house, and somehow they had to come up with $50,000 or they would get kicked out. And there was no one else for them to go to. So while Barbara knew it was stupid to stay with her younger sister, she did it anyway. There might be some small chance that she could get her sister out of the way before they got caught. On into the night they drove until they had arrived in front of the street. Sandy deployed the lever, and the water began to pour out of the back as they began to ice up the front of the bank. They turned around and drove back. By the sixth time, it was having trouble driving across the ice that it had created. The entire bank was now slick with ice. It was 5 a.m. Somehow, they hadn't been caught. Barbara said, "What now?" "We hide the Zamboni and report it stolen once we get the money from the robbers." Sigh. "And when are they robbing it again?" "At 10. "And how are they going to get into the bank?" Sandy looked at the icy, slick wasteland that had been set up. "Good point." Finally, Sandy walked into the front door of a nearby apartment complex and stole the rugs. Then, one by one, she laid them down in front of the bank. "They can walk in on these. That means we'll have to pull them up when the heist is over." Hank knew there was something odd about the job once they approached the front row and saw all the lines of carpets that had been laid down in front of him. He also decided that he had been right about the whole job being cursed in the first place. But that was because when you added up all the numbers for Philistulia in ancient Babylonian, it used the base 5 numeral system, it meant that it was a curse number. But Frank and Lenk didn't care. They wanted to rob this bank on this day, at this hour. Lenk had a particular sense of things, and if you didn't do it the way he liked, then he just refused to participate altogether. And that was something that Frank would not countenance. "The family that robs together has jobs together," he'd say. Of course, he'd also say, "The family that steals together heals together." which he only just barely liked more than his other dictum, "The family that mugs together, hugs together." Frank had truly missed his calling as an ad copywriter. Not that Frank was saying anything at the moment. Oh no, they were all consummate professionals, complete with ski mask, nylon face mask underneath that, shotgun loaded with rock salt, 2 pistols in entirely different locations, body armor, police band radio, emergency rations, encrypted radio, walkie-talkies, and black powder tennis balls. Frank liked to call them flashbangs, but Hank had seen the real flashbang, and a tennis ball filled with black powder was just a pale shadow of the real thing. Hank was just about to shout out, "Everyone on the floor," when he remembered it was Lank's turn to talk. The other thought that had occurred to him was the fact that everyone had to know that they were bank robbers given the masks that they were wearing. The security guard only had one hand, but they were lightning quick with that pistol and shot Frank in the gut. Good thing he was wearing the body armor. But it sure knocked the wind out of Frank, who rolled around on the ground like he'd been kicked in the gut by a feral bowling ball. Frank did his part and unleashed some rock salt straight into the security guard. The guard shrieked in pain and put her hands over her face and the small residual shots that got up in her eyes. Lank shouted, "Everybody, this is a stick-up! Don't do nothing stupid, Kay?" Hank zip-tied the guard's hand and stump. He didn't think a wet washcloth, then he took a wet washcloth and washed her face. Rock salt in the eyes or face sucked. He should know. He'd lost enough bets to Lank over the years. He didn't think the zip tie was going to do much good with her stump, but it would have to do for now. Hank bent down next to Frank. "You okay?" he whispered. He barely managed to keep from asking, "You okay, Frank?" Frank groaned but nodded. That was good enough for Hank. Lank pointed to a small box in his hand. "This is a cell phone jammer. You will find that your phones do not work. The alarm has been disabled. The cops will not be coming soon. So just sit back and relax." He then walked over to the nearest bank teller and held a pistol to her head. "Please open the vault, honey." The woman did not seem to be the courageous type. She was fairly portly with a pert, short nose, average brown eyes, and short carpet-like curly hair. She accidentally stepped on the hand of one of the customers on the way to the vault door. The customer shrieked in pain, and she slightly shrugged but refused to apologize. This was, Frank guessed, a force majeure situation. Frank had lost a house to force majeure once, and he was concerned as far as he was concerned, it was basically licensed to be an asshole. This bitch was definitely getting some rock salt in the ass on the way out of here. Lank waited a few moments and then opened the door once she'd loaded the combination. He looked at Frank and then Hank and sighed, "Frank, get up." Frank mumbled something. Hank didn't even bother. They were lucky they had gotten Lank to even put the mask on, much less do anything else. "It's going to be a while before he can get up. He looks pretty winded." Lank nodded. "All right, then. I want every person here to come into the vault and grab a bag of money and follow me." Using the bank customers as free labor, on some level, Hank knew this was a bad idea. But when he immediately thought about it, he couldn't decide why. After all, it wasn't about reducing charges to show of killing anyone. There was always a risk of that. Plus, Frank was an insanely good planner, so they were probably fine. As the volunteers went out of the door, they began to slip and slide in every conceivable fashion. "What the?" Hank went to the door and saw the carpets that they had crossed to get in the bank had been pulled away, surrounding the front door into a veritable sea of smooth ice. The running truck in front of Jank might as well have been on the moon. Hank started to speak up. "We have a problem." Lank ignored him at first. He was quite belligerent when he wanted to be. More people were afraid that they would get shot, so they walked out into the ice and most spilled. There were bags of money and people everywhere. Hank could see that this was going south very quickly, so he shot the pasty-faced doe girl with the rock salt. He wanted to take advantage of the chaos while he could. She screamed in panic and all hell broke loose as some of the customers attacked Lank and one tried to attack Hank. Hank knocked him flat and then shot him point blank in the face with rock salt. The man shrieked in pain. Michael Garrett's prophecies were never wrong. He only made one every 775 days based on the number that had been given him by a fellow believer in numerology. Michael had never met Hank 1497, but he meant to thank him if he ever did. The chickens would finally be free. No one understood his struggle. Well, maybe Hank did, but Hank was no doubt somewhere far, far away from Fistalula, Michigan. Somewhere good, somewhere wise. Michael Garrett was what the government would probably label an extremist. He put the welfare of animals on par with his own. He saw nothing wrong with this, in part because he felt people were animals themselves, and showed it in the little things that they did every day, but also because animals had so much potential in them. You just had to look into the eye of a puppy or kitten to know how much love it could show. Granted, the eye of a chicken did not have as much light as their mammalian cousins, but that was the challenge, wasn't it? If one restricted one's belief to simply helping the easier species to empathize with, you were at best a hypocrite. At best, well, even at worst even, bigger hypocrite. And if there was one thing he would never allow himself to be, it was a hypocrite. He'd rescued the chickens when they were waiting for slaughter 7 months, 7 weeks, and 7 days ago. The prophecy had told him where to find them. Granted, he had had to wait 440 hours for them to actually arrive. Technically 442, but he figured that the prophecy didn't take into account the time he'd spent to get the lottery ticket, because the lottery ticket was wrong. He knew that now, because he hadn't won. But the prophecy was true, and this proved it. He knew it with every fiber of his being, and was prepared to do whatever it took to testify to the truth. So now he was going to prove it to the world that he was right. The prophecy had told them that there would come a time of chaos and destruction. And as he gazed out of the window in the basement, he knew that there had indeed been now chaos and destruction. Bags of money and people slipped back and forth across the ice. He saw 2 little girls ice skate in, grab a bag of money, and then skate away. Now was the time. He opened the door, and hundreds of chickens spilled forth from the basement. Free! He heard them cluck in their secret language. Free, 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 free! For months he had fed them in the rented basement apartment. For months he had bought cleanser and scents to keep the landlord from finding out, and now they were free. They were alive, thanks to him. All according to prophecy. Daniel liked Daniel because they shared the same name. So when he sat there and listened to Mr. Hoofbaugh talk about Daniel in the lion's den, he leaned up and paid attention at the seat as far as he could go. Normally Daniel had no tolerance for Sunday school, but he could tolerate discussions about Daniel, or about cake. Fortunately, the class was large, which meant cake about every 3 weeks. For some reason that Daniel could not understand, there were no birthdays in June. This was the 4th year in Sunday school, and he had begun to refer to June as Cake Wasteland. The Great Cake Divide. The cakeless wilderness. Daniel, pay attention! I was paying attention, Mr. Hoofbaugh. Oh? Yes, I was paying attention, Mr. Hoofbaugh. Are you sure about that? Yes, Mr. Hoofbaugh. Oh, this was trouble. His mother was always yelling at him when she found out that he hadn't been paying attention. You're lying to me. I am not! Mr. Hoofbaugh sighed and shook his head, clicking his tongue disappointedly. Fine. When? When? Mr. Hoofbaugh grinned. Yes, when? Daniel had to pick a time. Was it specific? Was it now? Was it when Daniel the prophet had been in the lion's den? Without missing a beat, he said, January 14th, 1995. Mr. Hoofbaugh crunched his nose. What? Apparently, that was an acceptable answer. Good. January 14th, 1995. What's so special about that date? Daniel shrugged. That date won't happen for another 20 years. That's not your birthday. Daniel should know. He could have had a cake a month and a half early. Why exactly did you pick it then? Daniel shrugged. Mr. Hoofbaugh looked dubious and started to get angry again when little Timmy, God bless little Timmy, said, I would choose today. What? Oh, why would you choose today? Because my mommy's in the hospital. Everyone looked at Timmy sympathetically. Little Josephine kissed him on the cheek. Well, I hope God does answer all your prayers today, Timmy. Mr. Hoofbaugh leaned down and hugged Timmy. I'm sure he will, Timmy. I'm sure he will. And then he looked at Daniel. Well, maybe God will answer your prayers on January 14th, 1995, Daniel. But he isn't answering them today. I'm telling your mother, Daniel swore. I'm telling her about that, too. The chicken did not know it was free. The chicken only knew that it was cold. The snow on its claws hurt. It pecked the ice out of frustration, looking for something to eat or sharpen its beak, but found nothing but more ice that made its beak cold. It slowly shivered in the cold. It cowered behind a large bush as it heard loud noises, but then it could sense the warm air coming from the large car in front of it. The human tried to get out of it, but the chicken ignored him. Or the chicken tried to get it out, but the chicken ignored him. The heat was good here. It was so glad to be warm that it was almost curious by the 3 masked men that ran into the snow, away into the snow. But its curiosity went away when the human made many more loud noises with the stick in its hands pointed at the masked men. Nerdman Lockshear sat in his chair and counted money. He was good at it. In fact, he was psychotically good at it. He enjoyed the feel of it against his flesh. He enjoyed the sound it made from coins of the press of the light green cotton paper. He could tell the difference between currencies in Europe, Asia, the Americas, or Africa. He knew them by sight, sound, and smell. And yet, one might ask why he simply was running the largest bank in a small rural county in the middle of nowhere. Because he could be one fairly talented banker in a large city like New York, or he could be God here. He could hold the fate of anyone he chose in his hands. Take, for example, the lord of one Mr. Jared Kittonson. Ethically speaking, Nerdman was fine with it. He had offered Jared an out. He had warned him 3 times before signing the loan, and he had already warned him in writing. He had offered him a graceful exit without letting his children know, in exchange for his land. It was true that Nerdman was aware that Jared would never sell his land, but that was just fine with Nerdman. All that mattered was that he gave him the chance, and Jared had failed. And he was set to take the house. He was not a simple villain. He was an exceptionally competent villain, and he happened to enjoy making people's lives miserable. The thing that he enjoyed most was the fact that everything he did was totally legal. The society of the pure and just allowed him to get away with killing people, just doing it by poverty and exposure instead of a knife and a gun. But instead of quietly dying, Jared's 2 girls had come in, asking for the terms to buy the house back. So for amusement, he told them that if they could produce $50,000 in cash before the mortgage was due, the small one had been wise enough to get it in writing, but that didn't mean much. And now they sat in front of him trying to convince that they'd received the money legitimately. Delightful. He'd heard about the bank robbery, of course, and he was quite sure that the 2 had received it since then. So will you take it or not? Very well. After all, if he hid the money for long enough, who would know? He smiled and signed over the lease. The girls hugged at each other, thanked him, and left. Nerdman chuckled to himself. Suckers. Daniel was late for work, and his car had stalled. He could not afford to miss work. He would be fired. His wife was going to leave him if he lost another job. His kids didn't understand. He had to make this work. When he'd woken up this morning, he thought there was something special about January 14th, 1995, but he couldn't remember what. He'd thought he'd forgotten one of the kids' birthday. No. Wife's birthday? No. Anniversary? No. He didn't have time for this. He was late for work, and the car absolutely would not start. And so he said fuck all and began to run. It was 4 miles away. Maybe he could hitchhike. He started praying, God, anything, any way you can, and there it was. He thought it was a lawnmower at first, but it wasn't. It was in the middle of the road, and no one was around. He couldn't believe it. The keys were in the ignition. He started then Zamboni and drove to work. No one had noticed that he was missing. The bank had been robbed. He parked the Zamboni and made it look like he was part of the chaos, trying to blend into the crowd. His boss nearly looked in his direction, nearly realized what he'd been doing, and suddenly a bunch of chickens came out swarming all over people. And then he slipped on the ice and rolled in and pretended like he had been there all along. The robbers ran past them all and apparently seemed to get away. A short while later, the police arrived. His boss came up to him and asked, "Are you all right, Daniel?" Daniel nodded. Yeah, sorry. I've just never seen anything like that before." His boss hugged him. "It'll be all right." Daniel nodded. Word came later that day that the police had caught the robbers trying to rob another bank. This time, though, they had torched the money in the bank. Daniel's boss was ecstatic. "You realize what this means?" His boss grabbed his shoulders, hugging him while he jumped up and down. Daniel smiled and nodded, pretending to know what was going on. "No, what does it mean?" "It means Lockshear is out of business. He kept all his paperwork in the bank. He wouldn't trust it anywhere else. It means that he isn't killing us anymore. It means more business. It means a promotion for you, Daniel. This is the best thing that's ever happened to us." Daniel wasn't sure what to say. He was floored. He smiled and hugged his boss. "You're getting a bonus in your check next week." Daniel smiled and nodded. His wife came up and opened the car while his kids hugged him. She kissed him deeply and brushed his hair. "Oh, Daniel, are you okay? I'm sorry we've been fighting so much lately." Daniel kissed her back, quite happy. I'm sorry too." He looked at Susie Jenkins across the way. She was the best-looking employee at the bank, and she was looking at him like she wanted him. He winked at her. It was said that trauma helped people get in a randy mood. It looked like all his prayers were being answered. All of his prayers. So I'm going to give this story an A-, for a couple of reasons. First of all, This is actually the second time I had to read this thing. The first time I wrote it, the sound came out terrible. Second of all, I managed to avoid reading it this time, but for some reasons I don't entirely understand, I put a 3-paragraph book report at the end of this thing, or book review. Anybody who's interested in the book review, feel free to ask me at redanvilcreative@gmail.com. Yeah, so this story reminds me a lot of Big Fish or Brother, Where Art Thou? I was trying to write literature as compared to science fiction or fantasy, and literature is a pretty wide category, so it definitely works. It needed an edit job, and since I read it the second time, I was able to avoid some of the incredibly obvious errors. I tend to have my short stories, especially back when I was submitting them for publication, in 2 categories, right? One is finished, and the other is unfinished. I may or may not read the unfinished stories. If I do, it'll probably be in a separate section called separate series called Save from the Circular File. Let the buyer beware. It's going to be even more terrible than these. But the thing that amuses me is if it's in the finished category, I do think that there's a chance that I submitted the Great Zamboni the Great Zamboni napping to publication to somebody somewhere. So some reviewer somewhere is reading a story, which they may or may not have found amusing, full of grammatical and spelling errors that easily could have been fixed. But then they got to the 3-paragraph book review that I put at the end of this thing. So I'm just wondering in what alternate universe this story actually got published and confused the absolute hell out of the readers, because it's such a weird story that ending it with a 3-paragraph book report might have made just as much sense as the rest of the story.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright
2022!
To fight the forces of evil!